Douglas Brenner Shocks here in Southern California. I'm authorized Ohlins sales and service for both automotive and motorcycle, maybe the only one in the country authorized for both. I'm a shock tech for 30 years, not a guru, just a shock tech. And also, hard to believe because I'm so young and handsome looking, that I've been racing for over 50 years. So when I work on shocks, I put them in my car and I can see from on-track experience what's going on. I'm not sitting on a computer or just on the YouTube telling everybody what to do. I make my money selling and servicing. I can meet or beat any legitimate price on Ohlins products. And service, I'm as close as UPS, FedEx. You know, if you're in Southern California, bring them over. I stock almost every service part, so I can usually turn things around really fast for you. This is my Rohrig 2VS shock dyno. I've had it for, I think, over 10 years. I don't know exactly. I've had it for a while. Rohrig is the best one you can get. They are now owned by MTS. They sold it. So I don't know. I mean, it does everything I need to do. It's always been the best. Maybe there's something better now. This is the bottom of the line for the top of the line, the 2VS, 2 horsepower crank dyno. By changing this, I can go either a 1 or a 2-inch stroke. They have them $100 and something thousand with linear motors, and they can do 1,000 inches per millisecond, and pretty fantastic. But this is what all I need. I don't know, you know, even if I had one of those, I wouldn't know what to do with it. Because the dyno's only as good as what you put in it. It's not going to tell you if something's, how to make something better or worse. So anyway, let's get started on how to use this dyno. Okay, today we're going to dyno this TTX 36 ILX 36 Ohlins. IL stands for inline. The canister is part of the shock body. And this is how it came pretty much out of the box. The valving's standard. You have to add end eyes, and there's a lot of different ones, so you can tailor it to your need. So let's put it on the dyno. Okay, these clevises, I have a lot of different things for clevises on the shock, or just all kinds of fixtures, so that I can pretty much put any shock on here. Even though I only do Ohlins, sometimes I want to see what, if somebody gets an Ohlins, I want to see what was on their car before. We can take a look and get it critiqued. This is clevis, kind of like the one that's on there now. It has a little brass insert. Let me see if I can get close enough. That's in there, and you can see it stick out the bottom. And as you tighten this, this pushes down on the top of the end eye and makes the shock in there really solid, so you can get a good reading. If it's flopping around, you won't get a good reading. Although after years of doing this, I can tell when something's loose because I do it. So anyway, what we have here in the shock dyno, this is a load cell, and this load cell tells the computer how much force it's seeing, which has to do with how much resistance to motion the shaft is given at any given velocity. So the computer knows the velocity, knows what the force is, and it can tell you. It's a great piece of hardware, but it's only as good as the software. Same with shocks, same with computers. You can have the best shock in the world. If it's valved not so well, it's not going to be any good. So now this is all the way up. We don't want to top this off out when we're dynoing it. So we push down a little bit. Tighten this up. This is just, I use this to, like if I were doing 3 or 4 of these, I'd know how far down this went every time, and I can keep things real consistent. This is an infrared sensor. It tells me the temperature of the shock. And I can tell the dyno if I want to warm the shock up to a certain temperature and then do the reading, or and I can always see what the temp is. And that's kind of important because damping changes with temperature. Ohlins is the best at keeping that really linear, the differences. They really work on that. So this dyno set at 2 inches of travel, and let's start it up and see how it works. Okay, here I have my shock template, what I use to dyno shocks. On my Rohrig dyno, you can probably change this around to the way you want it, but this is what I do. First thing I want to do is go to Edit, Preferences, and make sure that the shock that I'm dynoing, the diameter of the shaft of that shock is the same as what the dyno thinks it is, which helps calculate pressure and a lot of other things, which I'll go into. So this TTX 36 inline is a 0.55, so that's correct. Then we'll open up a test. And the test I only use CVP, continuous velocity plots. There's peak velocity pickoffs, which I don't use, but I suppose they have a use. So anyway, this is a test that I've put together. I've named it the 10 IPS for inches per second. I've set it up so that when the shock reaches 91 degrees, it starts the test, but it warms up at 10 inches a second until that. And I use the gas test only. There's other options. With no gas test, TTX 40s, TTX 46 struts, any through shaft Ohlins shock does not need a gas test because there is no nose pressure because it has a through shaft, and it just doesn't see any gas at all. Same with like old-fashioned shocks, or I just did a Coney that wasn't gas filled to see where they were at for a car I was doing shocks for, and you can turn off the gas test for that. It doesn't matter if it's on when you're doing the test, but it just takes a little time, which you'll see, and it's a pain in the rear. So we're just doing the gas test on this particular one. Okay, so I've zeroed the load cell, which means I've hung the shock without being attached to the bottom from the top clevis that's attached to the load cell, and zeroed it so that the weight of the shock isn't getting into the equation. And here you can see that the nose pressure, in other words, the pressure that the shaft is outputting, in other words, if you were pushing the shaft in, it would take 32 pounds of force to get it to move. And that's because of the gas pressure inside the shock. And it's seeing this, and it will subtract it when we get going with the test. Then that's why it needs to know the diameter of the shaft. Because the dyno, the load cell only sees load. It doesn't know if it's damping, spring pressure, or whatever. So we want to kind of take out all the factors so we can just see damping. And also we see hysteresis, which in a way is spring pressure. It's not damping. But we can see those clearly. If we don't do it, it just, the dyno test looks about the same, but you really can't tell the amount of pressure in the canister, and everything just moves up. It would start at 32 pounds on the graph is all. And the pressure deal on this is pretty cool because once you set gas pressure in a shock, you can't find out what it is with a pressure gauge, because if you put the pressure gauge back on, some of that nitrogen bleeds into the pressure gauge, so you get a lower reading. The only way to get the true reading is on the dyno. And you know, when I get a shock back and I'm looking to see if it's okay, I can see if the pressure's up or down, or it gives a clue if something's wrong or not. So anyway, let's get started with the test. Okay, so let's start the test. Push start test. That's easy enough. And then we get this window here, and I've set it up the way I want. You put in your customer and shock type and vehicle. And there's all kinds of things I put in. Usually when I'm revalving, something like this, I just put in the notes as delivered. And I put the settings. This is at -10 on both. And hit OK. You can also fill from the last test. If you keep doing this same shock, it just repeats all the data and you can change whatever you want, or fill from file. If I get one of the beauties of this shock dyno is, and dynoing every shock, I dyno every shock that comes out of here. If you send it back to me thinking there's something wrong or needing service, I can bring up the last file, so I have all the info on it, dyno it, and I'll have what the dyno sheet looked like from the time before, and I can see how it's doing. It's really helpful. So anyway, let's say we filled that in and you go OK, and then it tells that the dyno is about to start. Okay, so let's start this. Here we go. Temperature is almost up to temp, so now it's slowing down. Now it's going to do the test for gas pressure, and it's going to take it's going to settle down here. All right, now it's taking that pressure, then it's going to move it to another place, see what the pressure difference is. It's calculated what the pressure is and taken it out of the dyno. Now it's doing the test, and that's all there is to it. It's done. Done, done, done. So now we have to call it something. So we'll call it YouTube test. And we'll tell it, this is just a blank because I don't want to show you all my customers, but it'll do the same thing. If it's a customer, I can make a folder and call it customer, and then open that, and then it'll store it in that. So if you give me a shock or a pressurized fork, I'll have the data under your name. So you tell it to save, and here it is. Okay, so this is this TTS inline. This is how it comes. This is -10. Up here, usually I'll put -10, -10, so I know what the setting is on this. I just didn't do it this time. Bad for me. But then I know what the damping is on this particular one. So basically, this is at 0 pounds of force, and this is compression, and these are pounds, 200 pounds, 150. This is rebound, minus, it's still pounds, it's still resistance, pounds of resistance. It shows the rebound is a minus number. And along here, this is velocity. So we're testing this up to 10 inches of velocity. And you can see as the velocity goes up, the amount of resistance to movement or motion goes up. That's what a shock does. Well, I'll go into it later. It's kind of a self-regulating thing. The higher the velocity, the more resistance it puts out to motion. So if you're on a really smooth track or smooth road, it's not putting out much damping. If you get on a bumpy road, it's putting out a lot of damping. It knows. How does it know? I don't know. This is a little digressive, and it's all right. So what this is, now this is the graph that you want. This is this graph here, which is force versus absolute velocity. And it shows what's going on. So this is now remember, this is at 10 inches a second. So maybe probably the hysteresis, if I showed this at 1 inch a second, which I guess the PVP graph could do, you might see a little less hysteresis. But this is hysteresis, and I'll explain what it is. So this is where the shock is at 0 velocity. See, it's zero velocity, not going anywhere, 0, 0. But it has some force behind it. It looks like about I don't know, 5, 6 pounds. And this is the opposite of damping. This is spring pressure. So actually, it's pushing the shock, or it's pushing against the movement, not pulling against it, or not putting out some resistance. So this is the shock speeding up. You can see this is 1 inch, 2 inch, and we're speeding up, and then it kind of, the hysteresis goes away, or they kind of overlap here. Some shocks I can show you have huge amounts, even way up here. So what's happening here is this dyno, this was tested at 2 inches of travel. So it reaches peak velocity at 1 inch of travel because it has to slow down again. It has to slow down to reciprocate. It can't reciprocate while it's going in one direction. So at 1 inch, this is starting going towards 2 inches of travel. And you can see it's slowing down again. The velocity is going down and the force is going down. But you can see here, now the force, as it slowed down, is different from the force when it's speeded up. This is hysteresis. And this is pressure built up in the shock. It could be pressure, it's squishing the, again, squishing's a technical term that all shock guys use. It's actually compressing the oil. Even though it's a liquid, there's gas in it and it compresses it. And sometimes if it's real high forces, some shocks, it might actually be the shock itself is expanding a bit. So what's happening, you can see here, it's about 10 pounds of force, opposite force, as it goes into rebound. So it's, until it gets here, it's not doing damping. There's no resistance, it's actually pushing. So the same thing, 1 inch of travel, slowing down, and there you go. So a lot of dynos, I don't know if it's the Dyno because I don't mess with them, but there's other brands. I don't know if it just, you can't show different types of tests or they're just trying to hide things. Certainly if they have a Rohrig, they're hiding things. So we go over here to graph and we do an average force versus absolute velocity, not force versus absolute velocity. Now doesn't that look nice? You can see a little, there's a little spike up here in compression. But oh, it looks so nice and smooth. Well, it's leaving out all the data. And believe me, there are shocks with so much hysteresis you can't believe it. But then when they show you the graph, it looks all pretty and nice. So you don't want that. Here's another graph. I don't know how to read this one. This is the original graph, the original type of dynos. And they were crank dynos. They just had like a crankshaft and a rod going up to manipulate the shock up and down. And because they didn't have it hooked up to a computer software, what they did was they hooked up the load cell to an oscilloscope, which just showed, the oscilloscope showed the voltage differences as the load cell got loaded or unloaded, and they compared this to a graph. They knew if there's so much voltage, it was showing this much force. And so this is really just an oscilloscope, what an oscilloscope would look like. So maybe people still use them. If you're an old-fashioned guy and you don't know how to use the new one, this will do. I mean, it gives you the info. I just don't think it's as easy, and people don't know how to use it. And there's other ones. I see some guy on the internet doing this. I don't know what the hell that is. It's force versus velocity. And he knows how to read it, so it probably tells him the info that he wants. I just think I see most of the people I see that I respect, not that I don't respect the guy who does this, but I see him using this particular graph. So I'm just a sheep and I follow along. Okay, so I've gone in now and I've changed this so there's -10, -10. Because we're going to do another test and then we can compare the difference. So what we have here is we have different things you can see. Here's the report. If this were filled out initially, we could see that. Here's the gas force at at the shaft is 32.21 pounds. Shaft diameter does the math. 135.57 pounds of pressure in the canister at 91.76 degrees. And here's different velocities at, or different forces at velocity. Here's 5 inches. The average compression at 5 inches, 127 pounds. And rebound is 142.72 pounds. You can change it over here, the increments, if you want. No PVP because I don't do it. Here's scaling. You can. I'm on auto scaling, but you can put in the velocity, minimum, maximum velocity on the chart, and force, minimum, maximum, if you want. Histograms don't take much stock in histograms, so I'll go over that in another video. But maybe some people like them. And then here's the one I kind of understand what's going on, but I don't like looking at it too much. So anyway, you can do all that, but there's the graph. So now I think what we'll do is we'll do another test, and we'll see what the differences are in damping. This TTX technology is fantastic. If this were a single tube shock of any brand, even Ohlins, you really don't have, they say the canister adjustment's compression damping, but, and it will definitely, you'll see the difference in compression, but it messes up the balance of the shock. You have to pressure balance. It's really hard to do. And then even if it were pressure balanced, it would only be most shocks 10 or 12 or 14% of the damping and compression. So it wasn't very powerful because it's only seeing the oil that the shaft's displacing. And if you start over damping there, I'll have a video on pressure balancing. TTX is no problem. There's no pressure balancing, and I'll have a video on why that might be. And no cavitation problem in these. And so when you adjust the compression or rebound on this particular TTX type of shock, it's 100% of the damping, both compression and rebound, and they're completely separate. So it's a huge advantage. You can play with it, and the adjustments are legitimate, let's say. So let's go to the dyno, and we will do another test. Okay, now let's do another test. We'll open up the test. We'll start the test, and if we had data here, I've changed settings, so we'd put the new setting in, and what I have I have the compression at -5 and the rebound at -15. So let's see what the difference is. Here goes the dyno. There we go, fingers out of the way. We already know, we've seen the temperatures here, and we kind of know what's going on. It's getting up, you see the temperature building. When it reaches 91, it'll start the test. Now it's doing the pressure test. So it can do the math. It settles for a while, it lets it settle, then it comes back, and it lets it settle. All right, ready to go. Here goes the test. There it is. So now what we need to do is put in the data we want. So what we can do is we can go up here and go YouTube test, and then we'll just change things a little. So we'll go -5, -15. And I always do it, this is just my way, you do it whatever way you want, but first is compression, then rebound. And the easy way to remember is C comes before R. So the compression is -5 and the rebound is -15. So let's see what the differences are. This is always so much fun to see what it comes up with. Well, there you go. You can see that the force in compression has gone up and the force in rebound has gone down. You can see a little less hysteresis in the rebound because we've backed off basically the needle valve's more open so it can relieve pressure in the shock. Open bleeds help relieve pressure. If you close your bleeds down, it won't relieve. And then there's more hysteresis here, and we can see. So there you go. There's what a dyno test looks like and the comparison of two adjustments on the shock. Also, if you want to see one or the other, you can separate them this way. So there's the original test, and then you can see how this differs. You can see quite a bit of variance now. How much bigger the hysteresis is on the compression side than the rebound. When we go back here, they're kind of equal because they're both at -10. So that's just some of the things we can do. And as the channel goes on, we'll do more and more stuff and see it on the dyno and try to figure out what the best thing to do is. So next, let's talk about what a dyno will do and what it can't do. Okay, there you have it. Why do you need a dyno? If your shock guy doesn't have a dyno, get a new shock guy. I'll just say that. I know they'll all tell you, oh, I've done it for years and I know what to do, but we all make mistakes. Also, there's faulty parts, and they put the shock together and give it to you thinking it's good, and it might not be. Chances are it is, but there's a possibility it isn't. I dyno every single shock and every pressurized fork, and if I revalve a fork, I dyno that too. But pressurized, especially pressurized dampers, it's super important to see what you can do. There was a guy, I did some of these fantastic, they're TPX, twin piston TTXs for rally. It's unbelievable. And there was this series, I think they've gone defunct now, but they used Ohlins TPX, and it was one of these things where you had to use the shock the way it was. Somebody valved it and they weren't too good. I'd get them bent all the time when they landed and stuff like that. But anyway, and there was one guy, you know, it's a spec series, and they had one official guy to revalve and do everything. And you could see the valving, you could get see what the valving was supposed to be. So the crew chief said something's up. He brought it over. We messed around on the dyno with it. Turns out what the guy did was there's a front and a rear shock, and they were valved different, and he valved them all. I don't remember if it was the way the rear was or the front. Had he had a dyno, he could have just seen he made a mistake, you know, and this is why you need it. So don't, you know, I know what they all say, oh, it's not necessary. It's necessary. It's a necessary thing. A dyno won't, listen, you've got a valve, see how it works, put it on the dyno, see what you've done. You know, the dyno isn't going to, it's not like an engine dyno where, you know, if you have more torque and more RPM, it's better. You might want that torque or in a certain place in there. But basically, you know it's better. A shock dyno, there's a complete disconnect. More damping isn't better. So what you need to do, you know, I use it when I revalve. I kind of know what I want to see, and I'll try it. And if it's better, I'll look and say, oh, well, that's good. I'll go down that path. But it's not a panacea. It's not something that's going to tell you. And guys, you know, I don't know. Don't buy it. Just You want a dyno sheet. You want to see what you're doing. But it's still up to you in testing and your shock guy to try different things and see what works. So anyway, that's it. Please subscribe, and I'm going to put my contact info underneath here. So if you need any Ohlins products, again, I'll compete with anybody. I will meet or beat any price. Send your stuff or bring it over for servicing. I service motorcycle and automotive parts, and I'll have to think of what to do next. So thanks again.